How do you answer the question, are you a Christian nationalist? What should we think about Christian nationalism on this slice of fresh bread? Welcome to Fresh Bread, a ministry of Grace Bible Church Gainesville with Pastor Brandon and Pastor Keith. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to Fresh Bread podcast number 17. Fresh Bread, where we're bringing the truth of God's Word to a starving world, and today, Christian nationalism.
Big topic.
Yeah, it's big.
It's and it's a dangerous topic in some ways because of what's going on, the national conversation that's out there.
I was going to say, it seems like it's everywhere. You hear that popping up. There's conferences and people are talking about it. So should we start out by, are you ready to define what is Christian nationalism?
Well, I think it depends on your perspective. I'll give it from, there's a secular perspective of Christian nationalism. It's the idea that in terms of the nation being a Christian nation and it being a nation that's governed by the laws of God, and it's in terms of what the secular media is defining it as, is that Christians are forcing their system of morality on everyone else. The idea that we're a one nation under God, but it's from a negative point of view because we're forcing Christianity, or at least Judeo-Christian worldview on everyone else. And so it's seen, in terms of, it's seen as a threat to secularism.
So that's a lot different than NPR. They define Christian nationalism as voting for Trump, being pro-life instead of pro-choice, and is a racist.
Well, the problem is that it's exactly what it gets boiled down to. This idea, you've got, the voting for Trump piece that, if I'm a Christian nationalist, if I voted for Trump, I'm a Christian nationalist if I'm pro-life. And so what's going on is the secular media is broad brushing, those who have a biblical worldview, and they're basically broad brushing that into something that is wrong and idolatrous, that we're making the nation into this idol, that we're a Christian nation, and that we're first and foremost a Christian nation, and really broad brushing some things that would be you and I would stand for. Like obviously I'm pro-life. I may have voted for Trump, but that doesn't make me this right-wing extremist, if you will. That's what I'm saying when I'm talking about broad brushing.
So can it really even be defined? Is it just sort of a term thrown out there, too broad of a term?
Well, I think that's where the broad brushing comes from. If you're saying that, if I believe that our laws should generally reflect God's law, and that makes me a Christian nationalist, if you're saying that, then, yes, I'm guilty. I'm a Christian nationalist. But if you're saying that I'm infringing, or I'm a guy that wants to infringe on, take away freedoms of Americans, because I want them to live exactly how I want them to live, and there's no other way, then, based on my choices, based on what I believe, then I'm not a Christian nationalist. So it depends on how you're looking at it, how you define it. The secular media, they're trying to color it in the most negative light as they possibly can.
So if I were to ask you, are you a Christian nationalist? You would say maybe, depending on how you're asking it.
Yeah, I think if you're asking me, are you a Christian nationalist, and you're defining it as, I believe that our laws should be generally based on God's laws, yes, I would be a Christian nationalist in that sense. I do believe that our laws should reflect the character of God and who God is and how God has made this world. I do believe that. Yeah, so if you're asking from that point of view, then yes, I'm a Christian nationalist. But if you're asking it from a point of view and how the secular media is trying to make it, I'm an insurrectionist, I'm against the idea of the nation as a free nation, no, I'm not that.
So Al Mohler, you mentioned Al Mohler, right? He calls himself a Christian nationalist. Do you think that's something that he should have done?
Well, I listened to quite a bit of his stuff, even getting prepared for this. I didn't actually hear him say that he's a Christian nationalist, but in the sense that the sense that I got from Al Mohler and listening to him would be very similar to what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Tag, you're it, in terms of if you're asking, do I believe that a nation of laws and those laws should generally be based on God's law, then yes. I think that's what he's saying. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and when you look at it from what you just said, I think every believer really is a Christian nationalist when you look at it from that point of view.
Sure. We should want I mean, it really comes down to anything less than God's law becomes a relativism. You and I talked about this offline in terms of, how we look at that. I mean, we all have a sense of right and wrong. Even the secularist has the sense of what's right and wrong, and they would say certain things are right and certain things are wrong. It's a matter of really who has the authority to say what's right and wrong. And the only ultimate authority of what's right and wrong in this world is God, because God is the one who created the world. And so as a Christian, I recognize that. I recognize that he is the one who's made this world, and anything that is right or wrong, he's the one who's defined it. And anything less than that is substandard. How he's made this world and doesn't live up to his character, if you will, if using that terminology, falls short. I mean, it falls short of God's glory. And so the problem is it becomes relativism, and ultimately it's going to sink to anarchy. Because if I say, we talked about it beforehand, and the Christian would say a man lying with a man is sinful, that it's against God's law. But then you get into the secular worldview, and they would say, well, a man with a man is okay. But then depending on who you're talking to, a 40-year-old man with a 20-year-old man, that's okay. But a 30-year-old man with a 10-year-old young boy all of a sudden becomes not okay. So again, as a Christian, I can easily point to God's law and say a man lying with a man. It doesn't matter. That is sinful. That's against God's law. But then you get into, with the secular worldview, where does that line get drawn? There is no standard. I mean, it's based, when I say relativism, it ends up being based on what, one person thinks. And so any law that gets made there's going to be people who disagree with that law. And so if as an example, shoplifting, is shoplifting wrong? Well, in the Christian worldview, it's theft. It's wrong. But then you get into the secular worldview and you get into, well, why are they shoplifting? And, is it because they have a need and maybe we should be fulfilling that need? No, it's sin. It's sin no matter what. Now, obviously, as Christians, we want to help people. And at the same time, we understand that if man doesn't work, he doesn't eat. So, there's that, there's biblical worldview, there's biblical answers to those questions that we as Christians can point to, but the world can't. The world doesn't have that standard. And so ultimately it becomes, again, what I've termed as relativism.
Does the world sort of do what liberals do with the Constitution when they believe it's a living, breathing document, that it needs to change with the times? And I think we see people doing that with the Bible as well, because the way the world is moving, we have, homosexual marriage, we have transgender. The Bible did not foresee any of this coming, so we have to kind of update it to fit with our times. And they do the same thing with the Constitution. It's outdated, was written by all these white guys, so we need to update it, whereas both of these are actually, they can't be changed. They shouldn't be changed.
Well, Scripture definitely is cemented, and it's God's word. It doesn't change. It's unalterable. The Constitution was written so that we could make changes. I mean,
we can make amendments to it.
Yes, but we can. And, there are methods and ways that can be. In terms of voting and Congress and the states and all of that, all those things have say in how these things go on, and whether we have an amendment or how we interpret things. The court looks at it and is able to do that. So there are ways, in terms of the Constitution, that it can be understood differently or it can be altered. But the bar to do that is really, really high. But in terms of the Constitution, I think you could say, I don't think it's a living document like Obama would say it's a living document. There's a transcendence, if you will, to that document that says that, that these are truths that we hold to be self-evident type of idea, and so these are truths that are given by our Creator idea, that, that's where those men that wrote the Declaration of Independence, those men who wrote and signed the Constitution and signed the Declaration of Independence, they held these ideas that are unchangeable ideas.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to the next questions that I have for you. Is the United States, has it ever been, or is it a Christian nation?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would argue that there were people that by and large, those who founded the nation had a Christian worldview and an understanding of who God is that was derived from Scripture, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I'm just saying, by and large, the people who founded this nation, that founded the United States, they had a Christian worldview, and they made decisions and they did things in light of that worldview. In terms of whether we're a Christian nation, there was a separation of church and state, that the government was not to dictate. The government and the church were not the same thing, that the government was not to take on the role of the church and interfere in the church in any way. And so, I mean, that's how I understand the separation of church and state. And so, in the sense of, is the Constitution Christian in that sense? I would have to say no, in the sense of it's not the church. I would have to say that the Constitution definitely allows for people to worship or not worship in whatever way that they want to. So that allows for, the Muslim to live in this land. That allows for, different religious worldviews. So that allows for those things, and allows for, people who believe differently to live side by side, basically agree on how we should be governed, and that we're allowed to go to the ballot box and vote for those who we think are going to govern us in a way that makes the best sense for us. So in that sense, no, I don't think it was created to be a Christian nation in that sense. But there is a biblical worldview there. But I think there's also the recognition. I mean, I think that the atheist can live under the Constitution just as soundly as the Christian who takes a biblical worldview can, because ultimately that atheist is not disallowed by the Constitution to be involved in the constitutional process of, installing leaders and, Supreme Court, Congress, president, vice president, Senate, the House of Representatives. I mean, obviously I said the Congress, but the point is that they're a part of that process. I mean, not just allowed, but encouraged to be a part of that process, and under the Constitution. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there is a biblical worldview that was there in writing the Constitution, in terms of, all men are created equal, that idea that's there, that's a biblical idea that's infused into the Constitution, into the founding documents.
Yeah. And what are the big three that God has established for a society, right? We've talked about this.
Yeah, the church, the family, the church, and government, civil government. I mean, those are the three entities that God is, that we see clearly in Scripture. I mean, the family, Adam and Eve, they had children, and that's a unit. Father being, the leader, the head. Woman and the children submitting to his leadership. That's an entity of itself. And then you have the government is there to enforce laws, especially to protect its citizens, whether it be against other nations or against each other, in terms of the things that they might do to one another. And the church is there to govern those things that are religious. And so I mean, that's the three entities that God has instituted scripturally.
Family, church, government, or would it be church, family, government? But we have flipped it where government, family, church.
Yeah, I mean, basically you've got government that oversees both the family and church. And so some laws are rightful. Obviously, if a father is abusing his children, the government steps into that situation and protects the children. If husband's abusing their wife, the government steps in the form of the police and the judicial system to deal with that. I mean, I think that's right. But what's happened is that government has taken, in many cases, authority. And part of that, at least part of that, is because, like marriage is in the eyes of God, and that should be a church family dynamic. And really the government isn't involved in that. But now the government, because of taxes, because of being seen as married in the eyes of government, because of taxes, the government now has taken over that because of marriage licensing. You get married in the eyes of the church, but that in the eyes of the state, they have to recognize that. I think that gives inroads into that institution that is not biblical, because I think, again, it's the church that recognizes marriage. But then how do you deal with secular people who aren't part of the church? And so it gets confused that way. The point is that government takes inroads into the family, into the church in ways that is not biblical and can be problematic.
So in the times that we live in, the government is stronger than the other two right now. The government is dictating what's going on. So as we look at Christian nationalism, I think they would say the yes to this, right? Should we separate religion and government? That can we even do that as believers?
I think it depends on what you mean by separate. I mean, so
politics and religion, should those be separate? Is that what?
It depends on what you mean by separate, because the founding fathers, they didn't want the church to dictate government, and like church and government to be together in the sense of you have the church that is dictating laws. They didn't want the other way. They didn't want government telling the church how to worship. So there's that separation. But where it gets messed up is, and what where people bring ideas that are not what was intended, is that, okay, who I am, if I'm a politician and I'm also a Christian, I should be able to bring my Christianity into my politics. Like, I should be able to vote. As an example, I don't even have to be a politician. If I go to the ballot box, I should be able to vote according to my worldview, right? I mean, I should have the right to vote according to, if I think abortion is murder, and I do, I should be able to vote for candidates who agree with me. If I think that abortion is wrong, and I do, I should be able to vote and say that abortion clinic down the street should be closed. I mean, I should be able to vote that way. I should be able to go to my judges and my, the judicial branch and to make my case before them, my case as a Christian worldview. I should be able to do that. And the Constitution allows me to do that, right? I mean, if you're looking at it from that point of view, then yes, I think that my Christianity and government does mix. I mean, it has to. And by the way, it goes the other way. If a person is an atheist under the Constitution, should they be able to vote those values? Yes. I mean, that's constitutional.
Well, I was just going to ask you this. It's funny because those on the left, if they vote based on their atheistic suppositions, it's called democracy in action. But if a Christian votes based on their theistic supposition, that is called Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
It's just a way of trying to make us feel like we shouldn't be doing this, right?
That's right. I mean, again, we've been conditioned by government, whether it's government schools or, whether you went to, a government elementary school or high school or a government college, you've been conditioned that you have to keep your Christianity out of it, that you can't vote your Christianity, that there's a separation, quote unquote, of church and state. But that's not what the founders intended. They intended us to be able to be a part of the process. And so I'm allowed as a Christian to have a worldview and to vote that worldview. And if it's wrong, I mean, if others don't agree, they're allowed to vote differently. I mean, it's the way the Constitution was written that allows people to vote differently or to engage in the process in different ways to be able to carry their worldview. And, at the end of the day, in some ways, majority rules. I mean, we all agree that if this is what happens lawfully, if lawfully this is what, the law that was brought into existence, or if this is the way the judge ruled, or if this is the way that the president acts. I mean, we all agreed that as long as they acted lawfully and legally and within the process, which I guess is the definition of lawfully and legally, but as long as they acted within the process, we all agree, even though we may not agree with the law, we all agree to abide by it.
How would you as a Christian not vote your conscience? How could we even do that?
Well, you couldn't do that and be voting according to your conscience.
That's what I mean. That's like, but they expect
it doesn't follow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can't disengage who I am, and when I go to the ballot box, or when I engage in the political process in any level, I can't disengage who I am. As an example, I used homosexuality as an example. I'm going to vote based on God's law. I think it's good and right that a man does not lie with a man. A woman does not lie with a woman. I think that ultimately they are actually hurting themselves when they do those things, that they're bringing condemnation on themselves even. Therefore, I'm actually voting according to love when I do that, a biblical worldview. Now, I recognize that someone who wants to do those things is not going to agree. And I recognize that. But that doesn't, again, that's why there's the process. That's why there's a constitutional process that lets us make those decisions, in terms of the process. And, I recognize, I do recognize, I don't know, I haven't completely thought through the implications of this, but I've agreed implicitly, by being born here, by living here, I am now a part of this nation. I am a part of this nation, and I am agreeing to abide by the laws. And if the law of the land says that it's okay with a man to lie with a man according to the law of the land, I'm not I can't take the law into my own hands. I should be able to speak out. I should be able to say that that is a sin, because I'm exercising my rights under the First Amendment to say that that's a sin. There's nothing wrong with me saying that. I mean, in terms of the Constitution, in terms of what the Constitution says, there's free speech. It allows that person to say that I'm wrong. I'm okay. I'm free to preach that an act is sinful, and they're free to say that I'm wrong. I mean, that's how it works.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the three categories again that God has ordained: family, church, government. The government has redefined marriage, which you really can't redefine marriage anyway, because God's the one who recognizes a marriage, but we do it, and so we legally let them, same-sex people, get married. We have the power in our church to say we're not going to do it.
That's right. We as a church,
for now anyway.
Well, we as a church should, under God, according to what we're talking about with the separation in terms of the three entities, the church, the family, and the government, we have the ability as a church, because we believe that marriage is not a government thing, that it's not primarily the government. We do recognize that the government has some say the way it's set up in terms of taxes and in terms of, recognizing marriage and that legally in that way. But the ultimate authority for marriage is the church. And so, as an example, Grace Bible Church would not recognize a homosexual marriage. I mean, and would not recognize that as being valid, and would not allow someone to be a member who is participating in a homosexual marriage, even to the point of someone who visits, in a long-term fashion. We wouldn't allow for that because it's bringing sin in the camp. And we should be able to make that decision because it's God who is controlling the church. Ultimately, it's Christ who's controlling the church. He's the one building his church. He is the Lord of his church. Because of that, we are able to make that decision. And thankfully, up until this point, the government hasn't interfered to that level. But, I say that. I know that there have been incursions in that way in terms of trying to force churches and other entities into, especially like Christian colleges and things like that. And that's where you get into the funding, where a Christian college gets onto the Pell Grant program and gets money, funding through the government. As soon as they do that, I mean, they're opening themselves up to now being dictated to as to what they can believe in terms of how, or at least what they practice. Because if they don't do what the government wants them to do, the government is, by rights can take the money away from them. And so it puts these entities into a compromised position.
And we're talking about Christian nationalism, and we can unpack this more. There's so much here. We're just trying to sketch a giant canvas right now, and we're hoping to come back and paint it with more vibrant colors. But as we look at our country, I'm just going to ask this to you: is the United States exceptional, and is it specially blessed by God? What do you think of that?
I think that historically, the Constitution and the way the Constitution was written, the heart behind the Constitution, I think that the Lord has blessed that process. I do think that the Lord has blessed this nation because it has, by and large, been a nation of laws that reflect his character, that reflect his commandments. Do I think that we are a nation that is above everyone else because of that? Do I think that there's something ultimately different about the United States? No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that there's an exceptionalism about us, that we're just one nation among many nations that have existed. And here's what we have to recognize. God has his law. That law reflects his character. That law reflects how the world has been made. Let me give you an example. Male and female. God created them male and female. Anything that goes against that is substandard, his standard, meaning, when I say substandard, I mean it doesn't meet his standard. Anything that it goes against that is something that is less than the ideal. And so if God has made the world in a certain way, if we follow that, there's going to be blessing because we're following how he's made the world. So if a man lies with a woman and has children, God generally is going to bless that because that's how he's made the world. It's just the way it works. Thou shalt not murder. We're going to flourish because of that. Whereas, a nation or a people that are okay with murder, I mean, and they have existed, they're going to wipe themselves out ultimately because they're okay with that. If we generally enforce that, telling the truth is the right thing to do, that we believe as a people that we ought to tell the truth. If we generally enforce that in our laws and we honor that in our laws, we're going to be blessed if we do that, right? So anything that goes against God's law, God is not going to bless that. So what I'm saying is specific to the United States, as we have reflected, as our laws have reflected God's law, I believe there's been blessing. And that's any nation. I mean, as their laws reflect God's law, there's going to be blessing. As those laws begin to diverge and go away from what God says, that blessing will go away. And I think that's what we're seeing, in terms of the United States, as we have departed from, those things that God says is good and right. As we depart from those things, I think that we're seeing more and more of the opposite side of blessing. I see, being, even cursed. Ultimately, the world being against us. And I think that's what we're going to see as the nation continues to spiral, as we continue to pull away from what's good and right. I think that we're going to continue to see that. And there isn't anything that makes us special. I mean, the name United States doesn't make us special.
Yeah.
It's to the extent that we obey God.
You just got me thinking, because when you were talking about that, it is interesting that there are formulas that the Bible gives us for life, that if we follow them, our lives are better.
That's right.
And you just made me think of our laws, if we stay biblical, because even in a marriage, if a wife submits to the husband and the husband loves his wife the way Christ loves the church, that marriage is so much stronger.
That's right. Because it follows it follows God's way, right? I mean, so if I follow God's way, there's going to be blessing. If I follow God's wisdom, it's wisdom, right? It's God's wisdom because that's how God has made things to be, and He understands it above anyone, right? He's transcendent of man's way, and so His way is always going to be the right way. And so, to the extent I follow that, there's going to be, whether as a husband or whether in my family or whether in my church, or whether the government, to the extent I follow that, then there's going to be blessing. And as Christians, we shouldn't shrink back from that, right? I mean, that is right and true, whether it's popular or it's not. And we live in a world today where it's becoming less and less popular to say that. Now, it's becoming less and less popular, at least among many people, that we should say that God's way is the right way. But we shouldn't shrink back from that. And if that's what it means to be a Christian nationalist, then I'm guilty, if that's what it means.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I look at God as sovereign. I know you do too. And so nations are created by him. So the United States obviously was a nation that was created by God for a purpose, and it could just be as simply as World War II. If there was no United States, who knows what Germany might have accomplished, and Japan. The United States was able to stop both of them with the help with England and Soviet Union. But it could be that simple. God can raise them up and he can bring them down. And we see Great Britain had its moment, it's down. We don't know what the future holds, but we know that God is in control of what's happening everywhere. Some people do look at the United States as kind of Israel. It replaces Israel as God's nation, right? And I think that's a little extreme when you look at that.
Yeah, I don't see the United States as being as replacing Israel in that sense. I don't think that, I mean, God used Israel in my opinion, will use Israel in the future for his special purpose. And I think that but I do think that as we obey God, as our laws reflect God's character, then he will bless us. But I think that's true for every nation that has ever existed. And by the way, Paul says in Acts chapter 17, he says this is Acts 17, verse 26. He made from one man every nation of mankind to inhabit the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and their boundaries, or the boundaries of their habitation. And so, according to Paul here in Acts 17:26, everyone descended from Adam. Every nation then came from Adam. Every nation has come from Adam, from one man, to inhabit all the face of the earth. So God is the one who, by his sovereign hand, God is the one who has caused the United States to be where it's at, and has determined their appointed times. You have the Roman Empire was there, the time that the Roman Empire existed, the fact that it was there, the time that it existed in, is all appointed by God, and the boundaries of their habitation. So their borders, are set by God. Our borders, the United States borders, the fact that we, 1776, we declared independence, and, that we were able to fight for independence against England, that was appointed by God to happen. Now, he uses sinful man and for his purposes, and, you could say, well, I've heard it said that the United States was wrong for declaring independence and fighting for freedom against Britain. But even if you take that view, even if that's the view you take, it's still according to the sovereign hand of God that happened at that time, and that the borders that we have, that have formed to this day, that through purchase, through war or whatever, has been, appointed by God. He's the one who set those boundaries. He's the one that sets that time. And we have to understand that. And to the degree that we obey him, to the degree that our laws, saying it a different way, to the degree that our laws reflect his character and his glory, or his, again, say in a better way or a different way, his law, then he's going to bless us. And I think as Christians, we see that, and we should fight for that, right? There's nothing, that's not being wrong. It's not wrong for us to fight for that. That's the biblical worldview. And I think I know Al Mohler says it a lot, that it's about human flourishing, that we see the biblical worldview leading to human flourishing. And I think that's right. I think that the secular worldview is a worldview that's going to is bankrupt and ultimately will lose just from the fact of, as an example, by and large, secularists don't want to have a lot of children. And, Christians by and large, who are biblical Christians, see children as a blessing from the Lord. Well, let's go 3 or 4 generations down the road, who wins that battle? Those who take a view that God exists, by and large, are having more children than those who don't. Yeah. Those who take a secular worldview are having less children.
Just to talk about the United States again, it's never was perfect. We did some things, manifest destiny. That doesn't mean that the entire what we've done is evil, is wicked, because there has been a lot of good things that have come out of the United States as well.
Well, I think what we have to recognize as Christians is that we live in a fallen world, and that it's never going to be perfect. And by the way, if I haven't completely thought this through, but if our laws generally reflect God's character, then God will bless that, which means that he's going to use us in judgment of other people. It doesn't necessarily make everything that we did right, doesn't make it all good, but he does use nations to judge other nations. And we have to recognize his sovereign hand in doing that he used the United States, to judge people as we expanded. Doesn't necessarily, again, make that every situation right. But we shouldn't sit in judgment over people who lived 100 years ago or 200 years ago or whatever and think that we would have done anything differently. I think there's an ultimate pride there to think that we are somehow better because we're more enlightened than they were.
All right, let's put a pin in this and let's come back and talk about it in our next broadcast. There's so much here. You've been listening to Fresh Bread, a ministry of Grace Bible Church, Gainesville. For more information, go to gracegainesville.org. And thanks for listening.